Welcome to the Perennial Pride podcast, where you're going to learn new strategies outside the typical advice to help you gain control and freedom of your wealth and maximize impact for your family, for future generations, and the community at large. Now, every episode is designed to really help empower you to determine what's the best course of action for you on your personal journey to financial freedom. And today, I'm really excited. I have a tremendous guest. You're gonna love what he's going to share. Bryan McCloskey, founder of Revisionist Wealth. I've known him for a number of years. Really admired the work he's done, and his area of specialty is around retirement income planning. We get so wrapped up in building wealth and accumulating wealth, but we forget sometimes to think about how we're going to actually use our wealth, especially after we stop working, if that is something that you aspire to go to. So, Brian, really appreciate your time and welcome you to the Perennial Pride podcast.
Tom, I'm excited to be here. I mean, just having known you for a number of years and known and heard some of the podcasts you already have in the hopper, I'm honored that you have me on, and we'll see what I can share with your audience today.
No, I'm sure it is. When we think about retirement, it seems like that's what people are aspiring to get to. This is what, is supposed to be the epitome of financial success certainly in this country. Now, we know we may have a separate opinion around retirement, that word itself, but we know people are striving for that. And there's a lot of challenges that come about from preparing and when you get to retirement. And we know full well that every day, was it maybe 10,000? I think the number I saw of baby boomers who are entering into retirement each and every day. It's an astounding number. And I don't know how many are actually really prepared and ready for it. So I'm going to use your insight to help us kind of share with our listeners today just some of the general challenges people face with retirement. This won't be the one and only podcast we have together because we're starting off just talking about this topic. But before we go into any of the details of it today, can you share with my listeners just a little bit about yourself, your background, kind of how did you get to specializing in this space?
Sure. I mean, and I'll make it as short and sweet as possible for the folks that are listening, but essentially I just was compelled to learn about this puzzle called retirement. And it is interesting that you bring up the concept of the word, or like the definition, which is that point where people get to probably in their 60s, possibly sometimes earlier, sometimes later, where people say, I'm done working. And then they're supposedly just supposed to unpack everything they packed in the bag is supposed to just work for them. Well, what I found out when I was, moving through my career and seeing different phases of people's lives and clients' lives, is that retirement itself is an incredibly intricate puzzle, and there's a lot of moving pieces. And actually retiring is nowhere near as easy as saving for retirement. And I say the word easy. I mean, listen, people work hard but there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to retirement. One of the things that we'll probably talk about is that I often joke that people become their own HR department. They rely on HR their entire life for payroll deductions, for health benefits, and for saving for retirement, all this stuff. And then when they find themselves in their 60s, typically, and all of a sudden they have to make all these decisions and piece it all on their own. So that's where, I actually came up with, I kind of built my business and my practice and the work that I do with clients come alongside people as they're approaching that time period and really help them navigate all the moving pieces. I mean, I have a background in science. I have a background in applied science, actually in sports medicine. And I've taken some of the same skills to where I learned how to identify causes, identify problems, work to find, tools and solutions to fix them. And then ultimately, make the situation better, both for my athletes in the past, we're talking about over a decade ago, and for my clients now who are approaching and entering and in retirement. So that's a little nutshell. It's a lot of fun.
I appreciate that, sharing that. And certainly interesting to understand how you approach it and how you use facts and science behind what you do to really help prove to people what they can do that's better than maybe what is already out there, and helping them discover that for themselves. So before we get into any details, I want to bring a little levity to this topic because finances, as we know, can be a tricky subject for many. I think I saw some stat where people would rather talk about death before they talk about personal finance.
Definitely before they talk about taxes.
Yeah. So I wanted to share one quick little joke. I know you appreciate jokes.
I do.
But I recently finished a book called The Wealthy Gardener. If you haven't read it, and listeners, if you haven't read it, I would highly encourage you to read it. It's really good about general finance, personal finances, and how to think about your money. But here's one little joke for you, and see if you heard it. What did the gardener do after they retired?
Oh, Tom, what did the gardener do after they retired?
Not mulch. Yeah, I get it. So, listen, I saw that and made you chuckle a little bit. I figured you'd appreciate it. But no, on a more serious note, there is this concept of a retirement experiment that's going on in our country since the 80s ish, somewhere in that
This
year.
is the first generation going through the back end of this. Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is, and they're coming into this world, like I said, thousands entering into this space, and they've come from the product of a changing environment from, the world of pensions and where you can actually save money and earn some interest, not like banks today, just a different world. So the one stat that really just shocked me, and I had to kind of take a second glance at it, was that nearly 50% of people ages 55 to 65 literally have no savings for retirement. In the one of the most amazing countries in the world. How can that be possible? So, I want to start with that sort of stat and maybe just get your lens on what do you see that's contribute to that? Like, how can we have that?
Yeah, that is an unfortunate statistic. And there's I've read that statistic and we've shared that stuff back and forth. And it's kind of daunting. If you think about it, 55 to 66-year-olds is that swatch of folks in that statistic where they say they quote unquote don't have any savings. I mean, so if you dig a little deeper, does that mean no savings in a bank even? Does that mean no savings or just no savings in retirement plans? I'm not sure, but that's a very daunting scenario, especially since, listen, I mean, we go around this concept of retirement. Retirement is, hey, I want to stop working for a check at some point and start having my assets create that check for me. Now, in retirement, aside from your assets, there's also the income that is created by Social Security when folks are eligible for it. And if a person has had at least a job for what's called 40 quarters, or let's assume 10 years, where they paid into the Social Security system, they'll have a Social Security check of some sort. But here's the challenge, like the largest Social Security check to debt, which means the strongest earner waiting all the way to age 70, is literally just above, like in the mid 3,000s, like $3,200 to $3,500 or somewhere in that neck of the woods today. So that doesn't go, depending on where you live, it doesn't go very far by itself. So it does become challenging when you think about the fact that could have been health issues. It could have been the system, meaning, the credit card system and the banking and loan system that enticed people to overspend. But that's a very daunting statistic, no matter what the source of the lack of savings. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's frightening. And listen, I've shared this story as part of this podcast too, the unfortunate outcomes my parents had that were they just mismanaged things. And to your point, spend more than they really could have and didn't take some of those basic steps just to save money. We're not talking about anything overly complicated. But it's certainly challenged so many Americans across this country. And, you talk about Social Security and people wonder if it's even going to be there, or at least maybe not in its current state. Are we going to start getting haircuts, before too long here? And so those are frightening sort of things to consider as we move into the retirement age.
No doubt, just one of the moving pieces. And that concern about Social Security. I mean, Social Security has been telling its future recipients probably for about 6 to 8 years, if not a little bit longer, that at some point in the near future, meaning 2032 right now, they are going to be reducing benefits payable to the beneficiaries. I don't necessarily see the light at the end of the tunnel in regards to that solving or being fixed, although it's constantly it's a constant talking point every year about what are they going to do? What are they going to do? What are they going to do? And for the most part, I personally believe people are going to be able to rely on Social Security in some form or fashion. But at the same time, it's not the only source or it shouldn't be the only source of retirement income if someone actually wants to have a comfortable and prosperous retirement. So that's why they're listening to your podcast, coming up with ideas on what they can do, what they can be aware of, but then also what they can do actionably to keep more money in their pocket and have it productively working for them. I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit today too.
Yeah, definitely. When because you talk about Social Security, and obviously we get taxed on this from paychecks. So It's a source of revenue for the IRS that could potentially shore up Social Security. But what does that mean? Higher taxes, which, I think a lot of people say it's inevitable that will happen. It's just a matter of timing and for the magnitude of it. But, before we get there, even thinking about retirement, the game, like I think of the game of finance quite a bit, and the game leading up to retirement is played a little differently than the game after. Can you talk about sort of that sort of transition? Because when you're in a world of focused on accumulating wealth and not thinking about creating income or distributing, how does the game change that for people who are kind of inching towards retirement, close to it, or even further away? How does the game change, and how was it require people to think differently about, their finances?
There's a lot of move. That's a great question for your listeners here. I'm going to do my best to summarize a lot of different moving pieces into the answer here. But the game does change when you're going from saving for retirement and accumulating, what you mentioned, accumulating over there, actually being in retirement, typically distributing, creating income from that. And it's not just a psychological change. It's not just where your income's coming from change. There are literal math differences, like mathematics. There's differences on how it works when you're saving into accounts and letting them build or letting them do their thing versus what's happening when you're distributing from them. For example, we're living through this right now. We're recording this podcast in early July 2020. We've lived through with market-based assets, we've lived through one of the worst first halves of a year since like the 1940s, if not beyond. When folks are accumulating, the irony is, well, let me start over here. When folks are distributing for they're close to retirement or in retirement, that is super scary when you see your accounts go down 10, 20, 30%. And quite frankly, from a math perspective, it can be very disastrous if you're forced to touch those accounts when their value is down. Now, there's some other things you can do when value is down, and there are benefits to that. We can talk about that in either a different podcast or about taxes. But that can be scary and mathematically challenging. Now, the irony is when you're on the accumulation side and still moving towards retirement and you're saving into 401ks, IRAs that are market-based, right? That downturn is actually beneficial historically from a mathematical standpoint, because every dollar is buying more of whatever asset it is that's inside of there that's market-based. And you're getting more of that when dividends are paid, they're buying and they're reinvested, they're buying more of that. So even things from a mathematical perspective, let alone psychology perspective, are different. Plus think about like the psychology of, I see this all the time with folks that are nearing retirement, early phases of retirement. They go from getting 2 checks a month that they know is coming on the 15th and the 30th or something like that, right? They know where their income's coming from. And then all of a sudden they're like, wait a second, Social Security is one time a month? And what if I'm delaying? And I'm lucky enough to have a pension, so I have a second check. Or if I'm married, I have 2 Social Securities and a pension. And then we got our withdrawal coming in. Like you're piecing together these checks. Remember I said you're your own HR department almost. You're piecing together these checks that you used to just have like coming in, it was hitting on the 15th and it was hitting on the 30th. And that could be a psychological challenge because folks have been saving into accounts and just watching their balances fluctuate, but watching them go up generally. And now they're sticking their hand in that cookie jar. And even that psychology can be challenging when you're going from the accumulation side to the distribution side. Let alone one more thing. I hope I'm not boring your listeners here, but one more thing that's really interesting is the tax piece. Like a lot of times our taxes are, especially if we're just wage earners, we can get into owning real estate. We can get into business owners and whatnot. But if we're just wage owners or wage earners in the family, taxes are easy. You have a number on line 1, then you get down to where your standard deduction is and you flip it over and everything's been withheld. And maybe you're getting a tax return that year or something like that, or a refund, I should say. In retirement, it's completely different. It's much more palpable. I don't think folks recognize how much they're actually paying in tax because it was always just withheld from their checks. And now they have to make decisions about what to possibly have withheld. And when they start seeing a number that's 10 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand a year, when they start realizing that Uncle Sam is going to force them in the very near future, that's what's called required minimal distribution. They're going to force them at some point to start pulling money out of the accounts where they deferred over here to save tax. What they were actually doing was putting tax until it's actually more palpable in retirement. So there's a handful of things that are different from that right side, left side, or from that accumulation to distribution side. And that's just a few talking points, for your listeners.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. And it makes it almost feel as if obviously as you're building wealth, you don't want to touch, you want to grow, you want it to continue to compound. And at the point of time in your retirement or later stages in your life, you want the freedom to use that. But it sounds like it's, especially in that scenario, you put money in a almost like a tax jail that makes it feels awful to grab, because now everything, to your point, is very transparent on what you're paying. And especially if you have market loss, like that's like a double loss after you use it. So it makes it challenging. And so preparing for that, I think is so key to know that's going to likely happen. And you have to kind of be prepared and maybe think about how can you get that money out with the least amount of tax, like putting in strategies around that instead of just having to take that tax pill, right? And take your medicine.
So I don't think folks realize it, but I'll just give you some round numbers that I've seen in some examples. Even if folks have $1 million in pre-tax accounts for 401ks, IRAs, they've been hard hard savers. They've had their investments benefit them over time, whether they're market-based or otherwise. Let's just say they have $1 million. Now, let's just say they want to create a reasonable income on top of their Social Security and maybe a small pension, reasonable income of 8 to 10 grand a year, right? So that's not all coming from their IRAs. So what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to just touch their IRAs a little bit, create, put some income on top of their Social Security that they can spend every month in retirement. And they're going to do their best to stretch their accounts over the course of their lifetime. I don't know if they realize that between their lifetime and then when that money goes down to the kids, if it's still in what I call a pre-tax wrapper, like in an IRA or a 401k type account, they're easily going to have paid Uncle Sam $500,000, $500,000, if not more, between them and the next generation. It's fascinating to walk through this with folks to really help them recognize what is their tax bill, one of the largest bills, by the way. What is their tax bill going to be through their retirement? And then when you get that answer, it's usually very eye-opening. And you usually realize, wow, I thought I was saving all this tax and I was really just deferring it. That's actually when we get to do work and say, how can we reduce that? How can we turn that 500 into 300? How can we turn that 500 into a 250 or 200? Listen, you're going to have to pay Uncle Sam some taxes on the stuff that you deferred. I mean, it's just natural. But I mean, you made that bed, so to speak. Think about that. You made that bed. Now we have to figure out how to get out of that bed without making too much of a mess. And there's things you can do. You talk about some of them you will be talking about them on your podcast with various strategies around life insurance, various strategies around tax-free accounts like Roth accounts and whatnot.
Yeah.
But that tax bill is a massive bill that, quite frankly, in my experience, hardly anyone has quantified it. And it's where you can make a big difference.
Yeah. And, every tax bill I pay today feels awful. I know in retirement, it's going to even feel worse, to your point, when I'm not having a steady stream of income coming in, and it could make it feel less tempting to touch my money. And then I said, well, what do I build all this money up for anyway? Right. Because it should be, our goal, especially in this podcast, help people figure out how they can have more freedom in use of their dollars all through life, not just when they're earning it and not just in retirement. And even to your point, the next generation, so they can freely use it to grow their lives and create more wealth for future generations. So it spans across all the streams of life from your life and to the next generation. So
I'll even add to that, Tom, and across decades and across phases of a person's life. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, what came into this industry actually because of some of the strategies I heard that were different from the mainstream strategies, quite frankly, that hinged around the use of life insurance strategically. And lucky for me, I embraced it before I even understood its true value. A good 15, 16 years ago, I embraced it. But then as I got into the industry and I got compelled to understand this puzzle called retirement, I actually realized more and more how valuable that the concepts around storing your cash differently, building accounts that complement your retirement, accounts that you can use before you're 59 and a half. What a goofy age, right? But seriously, aside from like there's some very small rules about 401ks if you're 55, but you literally are shoving money into a place that you virtually have no access to touching it for a very long time. And, you're trying to open up people's eyes to how they can strategically build wealth that complements their retirement accounts, build wealth they can use, build wealth that has tax benefits, build wealth that can help us in retirement undo this puzzle, or at least do it in a way that's more favorable to us and not Uncle Sam. So just a little rabbit hole I thought there about just understanding that there's, I focus a lot on retirement, but with what I've learned about retirement, I teach people to pack their bags differently a lot earlier in the process. And a lot of times they share that down with their kids once they learn it, because they're like, wow, I wish I knew about this 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Let me make sure my kids know. And then, of course, we go from there. So,
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's funny you mentioned the 59 and a half. I said, well, yeah, there must have been a rhyme or reason to that number, but think of half years as like when you're like less than 10 years old, right? You're saying my kid, and he's like, hey, he's two and a half. I'm like, well, what is this? What kind of relevance does it have to our retirement planning? It just, to me, boggles my mind. And it shows you the sometimes so many controls and rules around this stuff to manage it. It makes it much more difficult for anyone to traverse it, and you need people like you and experts to help.
so many acronyms, even. Yeah, even when we've talked a lot about it. I run a group on Facebook that talks about all those puzzle pieces. And one of the main things I look to accomplish through that group is to explain all this stuff in plain English, right? Because there's like all these different acronyms and all these different things that are confusing, and FRA and RMD and QCD. And that all means something, but to the layperson who's just hardworking mom or dad, wants to take good care of their family, wants to take care of good care of their spouse. It's like you have to go through a training to get up to speed on this. So really explaining it in plain English, and more importantly, how it impacts you, how it actually impacts you. You can read articles on tons of different things online, but the real question is, all right, what's important about that article? What does that mean for me? So like, that's actually where you can in some of the knowledge that folks are going to learn through your podcast and other resources.
Yeah. There's something I want, and this question is coming to mind now, and I have a visual. And sorry for people who are listening to this, it'd be tricky, but yeah, I think about retirement income planning almost like a seesaw. So if you think about seesaws, one side, if you're thinking the one side is really high, and then that means the other side is low. So I could say, let me have the most amount of income in my retirement, but then I'm going to sacrifice some maybe legacy for my children. If I flip it and say, hey, I'm going to be low on my side with the least amount of income because I want to pass on more to my children and the next generation, I'm going to have to sacrifice like I have in my whole life. And so I spend less so that my kids can have more. And so what I think you help us do and help others see is how you can actually maximize your income, enjoy more of it, and pass on more to the next generation. Why can't you have both? And we've been trained so much to think we have to pick and choose and have an or life. I want an and life. I want my income and be able to use it freely under my willpower or my will, and pass on more to my next generation so they can do with it, with good things with it. So can you speak a little more to that sort of philosophy? Does that make sense?
It does it? It makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things I'm thinking of as you say that is just how empowering it can be when I'm working with someone and they really start to understand the moving pieces, because it can be tough at times. Some folks are further along than others. They understand it, but in the grander scheme of things, it's really understanding how each decision impacts another and what to be concerned about. When they start to pick that up, it can be very empowering when folks start to gain confidence in, oh, I'm going to be okay going on a vacation, even when my accounts are down. We're going to be okay. Even if the market takes a hiccup, we're going to be okay spending money to take the grandkids here or there, because to your point, we've worked so hard to save this money up. We want to figure out how to enjoy it. The challenge that we have is that none of us has an expiration date on the bottom of our foot, right? Like if we could just lift our right foot up and take a look and say, oh, I know when, first of all, that would be kind of daunting, right? It's hard to wrap your head around that. Who would want to know? But like if we knew the expiration date, we would know how long you'd have to plan, and that would make all this retirement planning stuff easier, and income planning and spending and whatnot. Some folks joke about how they want the last check to bounce as they're hitting the box. I've talked to folks like that. My kids can do, what my kids are doing. They got as much from me. I want to make sure me and my wife are super happy. That's one philosophy. Another philosophy is I'm scared to death because I don't know how long I'm going to live and I don't want to touch anything. Well, that's kind of a crappy way to live. Another one is I want to give as much as I can to the kids, and so I'd rather not spend it now. And you kind of get into a space there where you're like, well, do you want to enjoy it with them, or do you want them to enjoy it after you're gone? And that actually opens up some conversations about, spending. And first of all, there's curveballs that are thrown. People think that they're handing their kids are planning to give their kids a nice inheritance, but they don't realize some of the tax headaches that come with it. There's some planning issues around the beneficiary type and account ownership designations and trust work that can be positive and or challenging based on it. There's a lot of moving pieces there, but I would say the word I was thinking of when you said that was empowering folks to feel confident about how the puzzle works so they can keep more money in their pocket, pay Uncle Sam his piece, but don't give him a tip, as we say. Tip your server, not Uncle Sam, right? Pay him his piece, but then keep more money in your family's pocket so that that people can enjoy it. And I think there's the conversations there, as you can hear, kind of fall at different places along the spectrum of that discussion. But going from a concern about, not spending to empowering to feel comfortable spending is definitely an exciting position to be in. And a lot of that can come out of what folks learn through your podcast.
Yeah, it's one of those, I think especially for folks who maybe are not as aggressively looking at their finances today, maybe they have maybe feeling like they have a longer runway to make some really more difficult decisions around their finances. I think this is where, you and I are aligned on a lot of these things is, listen, we do not, just like you said, we don't know when we're going to leave this earth. We don't know a heck of a lot of things that may happen to us along the way. So I think a lot of the approaches and strategies we take give people the maximum amount of options and control what happens. Give them some level of certainty and confidence that regardless of what happens, market volatility, disability, that are going to really impact our lives, that we will have things in place to be able to address them. And that's all I think we can do from our personal finances, because there's so many factors that involved, and we know tons of it is out of our control. And we don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. To your point, it'd be much easier. But having a lot of options in place and coordination of assets is what gives people, from my conversations with people who are a little younger, you're dealing with folks who are a little bit older, like knowing that they know the path they're going. And if they need to move a little bit, they can, because they're not stuck in one direction, and their money is accessible and not sort of stuck in one sort of channel with everything having to go right. And that's what I think I've seen some of your work with clients, that you're giving them so many levers that, others will not have, that they're positioned to win regardless of what happens. And that is a powerful position to be in.
Yeah, we have so I use frameworks for tax strategy, which open up people's eyes. We use frameworks for income planning, which creates income from different sources, sometimes more aggressive off of safer assets, sometimes inflation adjusted, inflation fighting typing, sometimes short-term income, long lifetime income. But I also have a framework. We have frameworks for buckets, or at least a bucket concept. And I teach folks, if we set up things in a certain way with different tax wrappers around them, different jobs around them, we have the opportunity to stick our hand in different buckets based on what the world dictates at the time. And for example, like this year, talking through with folks about what's going on in the world. One thing that folks do when they're retired, believe it or not, is watch the news more. So they watch the general markets plummet. And that's something they may not have done that much when they were working, but they absolutely, they have to fight them. They have to tell themselves to turn off the TV. And I tell them sometimes too. Because it messes with your sanity. But quite frankly, like when you talk through with someone like, hey, this is why we set up and we have this bucket, that bucket. This is what happens when you touch this one. This is what happens when you touch this one, which also could mean this is what doesn't happen when you touch this one. Like you won't be taxed. It won't increase the taxation of Social Security. Giving folks options, like you said, that's actually one framework that working with folks and having been in this space for a long time really is beneficial, because as Murphy's Law will have it, the market will crash literally like the week after you retire, so to speak, for folks that are hearing this, right? So what's the plan? And having a plan where there's different buckets that are doing different things, really increases that confidence. It's empowering, and it's fun to work with folks to open up their eyes about this stuff and help them really see, here's what I was just thinking right here. Investments are not the solve to everything in retirement. So what I mean by that is, because I get this with other advisors and other planners and general Wall Street, our investments are better. So come, let us check out your stuff. Literally, investments are not the sole reason, or usually one of the top 5 reasons why a plan will or will not work. It's actually because of the way the puzzle works. It's more where's your income stream coming from? What's the taxation of it? Is there anything you can do to reduce taxes? What about costs and fees? How can we get those lower? Do we have options and buckets in that bucket framework to touch dollars at different times based on what's going? Those are at least 5 things I just listed. And I didn't even talk about the type of investment. So, if anything, with what you talk about through your podcast, which is thinking differently about building and then distributing wealth, that's kind of the side I come from, the distribution and planning for that. It should be fascinating for folks to hear. It's not investment dependent. There's so many other pieces that actually make a bigger impact than just the investments.
Well, it is. And we started this podcast citing some of the unfortunate realities for some of the senior people leading into retirement about not having savings, but you do run across a lot of people who've done really well, right? Whether they've worked a job or they, maybe had a business or whatever, they've accumulated wealth and they're trying to figure out how to maximize the use of it. And you mentioned it, like some of them say, I wish I did this and thought of this 10, 15 years ago, right? And I wonder, could you share a little bit more, especially if some of the younger folks who may be listening to this and preparing for retirement, because something you do need to get ahead of, right? You can't just flip a switch and now I'm ready for retirement. Like, what are some of those basic things that maybe they can think about now as they're building their wealth in preparation for retirement?
Yeah. So this, I'm going to share, I do share this concept. I have a bias. Right. And quite frankly, every family that I work with also has a bias. And it's interesting to kind of talk through that because our biases help us gravitate towards messages that resonate. Right. So my bias that I learned was I liked dependability. I also liked understanding what was happening from a tax perspective, how much spendable income I can have and things of that nature. So dependability and, ensuring that I have access and the maximum spendable dollars I can, right? That's a bias of mine. Now, other folks have biases towards, they think, investing overseas is great. And they think, this investment or gold is the perfect thing. I'm not here to say any of that is right, wrong, or different, but I'm about to say my bias leads me towards things that are dependable and it helps me deal with the challenge of Uncle Sam in the future. Now, 2 quick things. One is I'll start on the back end and then I'll go back towards your question of what do the younger folks need to hear. The back end is if you've been super successful, like I've worked with a lot of folks that are in this boat, meaning you got a couple, over $1 million, a couple $1 million bucks. The million is not necessarily the threshold that dictates that, but let's just say you got a couple $1 million in various IRAs and whatnot. You got a problem on your hands. Now, that might land on you like, well, I thought I saved enough. No, you got a problem. Because if the majority of those dollars, which this is usually the case, are in pre-tax wrappers, has not been taxed yet, right? You got a problem because Uncle Sam is going to force you. Right now it's at age 72. And you could be thinking, I'm only 62. I got 10 years to wait. Well, guess what that means? That means that number 1, tax rates will probably be higher. And number 2, your accounts will probably be larger. So the problem just keeps getting bigger. You have a problem that you have to look at in the future. And if you don't understand or haven't fully wrapped your head around how taxes work in retirement, you start to realize, wow, like when I start pulling from this account, it makes more of my Social Security taxable. And when I start pulling from this account, it pushes me into the next bracket. And when I start pulling from this account, it increases my Medicare premiums. That's a curveball. Folks can try to say, well, I'm just not going to touch those accounts. But that's a problem in and of itself, because when you get to that age where Uncle Sam is going to start forcing that money out, he's going to force you to take it whether you want to or not. And that typically causes significant tax issues over time because it pushes you into another bracket, increases your tax rates, that sort of thing. So what can you do about it? Number 1, those folks appreciate some of the tax strategy that even when we implement it in their 60s and 70s, they're like, wow, I wish I started this earlier. So what are we telling the kids to start? We're telling the kids to start wrapping their heads around tax deferral does not mean tax savings, right? Tax deferral, pushing money into a 401k. There's reasons to do it. And that's not to say it's bad, but you can't just assume that's a tax savings because that's what all these folks thought. And they have their eyes opened up when they're in their 60s and 70s. So tax deferral doesn't equal savings. So what you really need to wrap your head around is, hey, if I plan on earning more over the course of my working years, if think I'm relatively in a lower tax bracket right now, even if it's in the 20s or even, consider early 30s, depending on what your trajectory of your career is, you may want to consider paying taxable dollars now and getting it in buckets or wrappers that are never taxed again. Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, kind of the same thing. and life insurance. And I'm biased towards whole life insurance because of how dependable it is and because of how it works as a phenomenal cash account that can be leveraged before retirement. But also, every client that I have in retirement is looking for a safe place for cash. And when they realize one of the benefits of life insurance and whole life insurance is that it's a terrifically safe place for cash. And when they realize, wow, if I started that 5, 10 years ago, if I had a nickel for every time that somebody said, I wish I started that, 5, 10 years ago, they would have the account that they're looking for. They wouldn't be hoping that 5-year CD rates go up to 3.5. They'd be earning more than that, typically in guarantees and dividends without being taxed on it, right? So now you have a bucket that could be built, that could be leveraged, that has dependability and tax components. And I got to tell you, when folks in retirement realize how valuable it is, they're oftentimes telling their kids that are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever it is, about how valuable it is. So that's just some insight there about
No,
what I see and what could have been done differently.
no, that's really powerful stuff. And to your point, it takes sort of like suspending our sort of minds a bit because we are certainly trained a certain way that, no one needs life insurance, say in retirement. And I would agree with that idea. But if you understand how, just like you just walk through how they work in concert with your other assets, investments, and actually make them do better overall, it's really a powerful sort of concept because I always thought of as you get older, how life insurance plays more not to replace income, but it actually replaces your assets. So that imagine I had $1 million sitting in an investment account and I had a death benefit of $1 million. Would that change the way you spend your other money? And in my mind, it would, because I can spend more of it knowing that the bucket's going to be filled up when I pass for my spouse, for my children, or charities I care about, whatever. And it's a really powerful sort of combination if you start recognizing how they work together. And it's not just investments or insurance, it's both. And, it requires a little more strategy on how to make them work together and complement each other. And so that's kind of what I gathered from what you said.
Totally. We're just scratching the surface, but you summarized it up perfectly there. Absolutely.
It's wonderful. So listen, this has been great. I know we're coming up on it here. This is a great initial conversation. I'm sure there'll be more. Hopefully people have gotten some good pieces out of this and we'll be tapping into some of these topics in a much deeper level. But we wanted to give at least a starting point, a sort of surface level view of retirement because it can be complicated. There's a lot of things to consider, but we want to raise these things. So before we get going here, Bryan, anything else that you'd want to share with listeners as they're thinking about retirement? And certainly if anyone's in closer, any last parting shots from your end?
I guess the parting thought that I have is especially for your listeners here, just accept that it's actually a lot more complicated than you were potentially originally led to believe. But that also shouldn't be overwhelming because, with the appropriate guide, folks can be asking you questions and you can be digging into it for them. That could be future podcast topics. We may even share the group that I'm building here so people can get questions answered. But the fact of the matter is if the listeners can just understand it's complicated and that they could have sources to help them cut through the nonsense to figure out what's the most appropriate things that address for themselves, they can actually improve their own confidence. And I think a lot of the stuff that you've already recorded on podcasts and you're going to continue to be recording on podcasts will continue to give them little bits and pieces and nuggets about how they can improve their confidence moving towards that phase of their life that we call retirement.
That's great. No, I appreciate that. And so again, Bryan, where best for people to reach out to learn more about you? I know you have a Facebook group that's starting up related to retirement. So if people want to join that anywhere else, can you share more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's called Retirement Taxes, Social Security, and More. That's on Facebook. And then my website's Revisionist Wealth. If anybody wants to go there and pull down a little bit about it, I got some good content on like Social Security and content on taxes and stuff. So they can definitely check that out. And then keep plugging in here to your podcast because I'm sure we'll be recording some stuff in the future and going on some deeper dives in some of these topics.
That's great. No, definitely. We'll put the links in there in the show notes. So people go check it out. Be tons more information there. And again, to Bryan's point, I think this is education meant to help empower you, to help you figure out things because it can get complicated, but the more you know and understand about these things, the stronger confidence you're going to have as you kind of move through your financial journey. So I want to thank you for being here today and at Perennial Pride listeners. I really appreciate it. It's, you know, personally, it's an honor to be a part of this and hopefully share some valuable information as you kind of move through your own journey for financial freedom. And if you've gained some insight through this episode, I've really follow us on any podcasting tools, Apple, Spotify, and certainly follow us on social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook. We're there at Perennial Pride. Really appreciate it. And leave some comments and questions. You always want to hear from you, see what's maybe on your mind and what we could do to help on your path as you're kind of taking control of your own financial life. We'd love to hear about it so we can bring you even better and more powerful topics in the future. Take care, and we'll see you on the next one.